In Parashat Shmini, we have the list of animals, birds and fish that we are not allowed to eat. There are three different ways of trying to understand these laws, dietary laws as they're called. One of them is historically, to look at the sorts of animals that there were taboos about thousands of years ago, or the sorts of animals that might have been worshipped several thousand years ago. That there were historical reasons as to why certain animals were selected as opposed to others. And that in a way it was really quite arbitrary, because all the Torah wanted was to create a different people, different to anybody else at that time, with a different way of life that would distinguish them. And the aim of this distinction was to get them to try to be better human beings than those around them. So there was the historical explanation. And if we were to go back in time and do our research, we'd be able to identify why it was that certain animals were allowed and not. Then there is the attempt to explain these animals in terms of function. In other words, you don't want to eat horses and camels because you need them for traveling. There are animals that you can eat because they are domesticated. There are animals that you can't eat because they burrow in the dirt or they are bottom feeders. And the trouble with all these kinds of explanations is that no one explanation satisfies all those criteria. There are always exceptions that don't fit in. There are birds of prey, you might say, carrion eaters, but there are other birds that are not birds of prey that we're allowed to eat. And there are animals that are not domesticated, like certain wild animals that we are allowed to eat. Then you have the idea that these laws are to do with health and hygiene. But the problem, of course, is that there are separate rules in the Torah to do with health and hygiene. And so that wouldn't satisfactorily explain these animals. And to say that some of them were more diseased, there were certain diseases that affected pigs, for example. Well, there were just as many diseases that affected sheep in those days. And there are diseases that affect cows, foot and mouth disease. That doesn't explain it either. And so within our tradition, we have two approaches to explain Kashrut. And bear in mind that in general, the Torah does not give reasons. These are chukim, these are statutes. So we don't know for certain what the reasons are. But those commentators who try to explain fall into two categories. There are those who take the mystical approach, and the mystical approach says this: if you have a set of laws that say, don't do this, and you go ahead and do it, it to some degree lessens your ability to be law-abiding. And so, if you take certain forbidden foods into your body, in a very physical way, this begins to degrade your body. Now, we can't take this literally, because plenty of non-Jewish people who eat all kinds of food that we're not allowed are just as happy, as healthy as we are, and some of us are unhealthy if we eat kosher food. But the mystical idea somehow is that something that is forbidden by God, if we ignore this instruction, it eats away at us in a spiritual sense. Then there's what we would call the utilitarian explanation. That is to say, there is a benefit to keeping the laws of Kashrut. The benefit is this: the aim of the Torah is to get us to think before we act, and to get us in our actions to try to be better human beings. And there are routines and habits which are beneficial, and routines and habits which are less beneficial. For example, having a routine of giving to charity is obviously more beneficial than having a routine not to give. Of course, it's better if you give with intent and good feeling and emotional and spiritual motivation, but if you can't, at least it's a positive, beneficial habit. The laws of Kashrut, because in theory they designed to get us to think before we eat, to think as we prepare the food, where the food comes from, what its impact on us is, how fortunate we are to have bodies that are able to eat because some bodies can't, and able bodies that function normally. The aim of these chukim, these laws in the Torah, these ritual laws, is to get us to think before we act. It applies similarly to Shabbat, getting us to be different to those around us, have a day which is different to everybody else's day. And so essentially the laws of what we can eat and what we can't eat, it doesn't really matter what the origin of these specific animals for being acceptable or not was or is. What matters is its impact on us now. If now they help us become better people, then that is what their function is, as well as getting us to think about God, to think about the spiritual world while we're in the middle of the physical world. It's a holistic approach to integrate everything, the way we eat, the way we pray, the way we think of being good human beings.